Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 54 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. Over these past few seasons, I've known that the Sharks have struggled in the regular season versus the Golden Knights. I know they're not picking up a lot of wins, but I didn't realize just how bad it was. With the Sharks' loss here tonight, they now have 11 straight losses versus the Golden Knights. This is the longest loss streak for the San Jose Sharks against any team ever, and the Golden Knights have only been in the league for a few seasons now. So it's kind of crazy to imagine, and yet, at the very least, at the beginning of that loss streak, it felt as though the Sharks and Vegas Golden Knights still played some pretty exciting games. I remember when this matchup was once regarded as one of, if not the most sort of aggressive rivalries, best rivalries in the entire league, coming out of that 18-19 playoff series where the Sharks defeated the Golden Knights in 7 games. If you had told a hockey fan that a Sharks-Vegas game was on, it was basically must-watch television. Now, just a few years later, it felt as though I was watching a San Jose Sharks versus Florida Panthers game. There was no emotion, no passion from this San Jose Sharks side, absolutely no fight, and it was like a zombie-like performance. And the thing is while the Sharks have been playing a decent chunk of games over a pretty short period of time, this still wasn't necessarily the second half of a back-to-back game. There wasn't some sort of cross-country travel that needed to be done. They just had to fly from California to Nevada, which is about a 1-hour flight if I'm not mistaken. So there weren't really that many excuses to necessarily give for the absolutely lifeless performance that the Sharks had. And what makes it worse is that it was just a few days ago where the Sharks put up a pretty much identical performance against the Boston Bruins. In both of those games, they managed less than 20 shots. Here tonight, they only had 17, with about a quarter of those coming in just the last couple of minutes when the Sharks had pulled the goaltender. I don't even know if they managed to hit the double-digit shot marker by the end of the second period. That's how embarrassing a performance it was here tonight for the San Jose Sharks. Like I said, you used to really get up in the morning excited for a Sharks-Vegas game, and now it just feels like another game on the schedule, and the Sharks were trounced in this one quite easily. To go through quickly the goal scorers, once again in the first period, the Sharks are slow right out of the gate. It's been a problem for them since they returned from the Olympic break. I don't know what's exactly wrong with this team. I don't know if their favorite coffee shop closed down near the arena, because they just do not show up ready to start any of the games recently. And that tonight was no different. They give up the first goal to Colasar, and they're down 1-0 at the end of the first period, and they were pretty lucky that they weren't trailing by a couple of goals at the very least, thanks to being bailed out by their goaltender, who I'll get to a bit later. In the second period, the Sharks did manage to tie the game early, and that gave a bit of hope that maybe there would be a similar turnaround like we saw in the previous one against the Seattle Kraken. But those hopes were quickly dashed. The Sharks, even though they got that goal, they tied the game up at 1. It was Noah Gregor, which was a very rare goal score from him, his only third of the season, even though he's had a ton of chances. You thought maybe that would spark something in the team. Nope, wasn't to be. Eventually, the Golden Knights would take the lead back with a Riley Smith goal. That would be the score at the end of the second period, and then the third, the only goal would be scored still by Riley Smith again to be a 3-1 victory for the Golden Knights. Obviously, on the scoreboard, this one doesn't look as ugly as some games that the Sharks have played in the past this season. For instance, that 7-1 loss to the Tampa Bay Lightning. But this is certainly right up there with one of the worst games that the Sharks have played, even still, even if their goaltender really made it so that it didn't look as bad on the scoreboard. Now, moving on to the players to talk about, honestly, I don't even know if it's worth going through each and every line here, because there's just no player who really stood out in such a positive light. There were a couple of players who I would say were okay here tonight. For instance, Ryan Merkley, I thought, had a pretty decent game. I would also say Scott Reedy, getting a second straight start here in the lineup, also had a pretty decent game as well, was even moved up in the lineup at a point here tonight. But otherwise, most players were rather average, had maybe a chance or two. I know Dzingel had a good opportunity in the first period, but were otherwise quite bad. If I was going to point out a couple of players in particular, it would actually be for bad play compared to good, and the first player who I do want to talk about for this would actually be Nick Bonino. Now, Bonino was signed this past offseason on a 2-year deal, mind you, for a couple of $1 million to try and bring some sort of stability to the Sharks' third line. You see, last season the Sharks were able to run a top 6 featuring Logan Couture and Tomas Hertl as their top 2 centers, which is very effective, pretty competitive, I would say, with most teams in the league. Not every team, but most teams in the league, top 2 centers, but their center depth absolutely just fell off a cliff once you moved past those 2 players, and so they went out, they tried to get a solid third line center, and it really looked like Nick Bonino was going to be that. He wasn't necessarily brought in to be an offensive force. If he managed to score 30 points in the season, I'm sure the Sharks would be rather satisfied, but he was supposed to be a calming defensive force for the San Jose Sharks, and potentially also a solid mentor to some of those bottom 6 young forwards. Well, the first thing is that Bonino has been stapled to pretty much for the entirety of the season, both Cogliano and Nieto, not exactly the 2 players who I would call young players that Bonino would be mentoring. And even so, it might be even a better thing that Bonino is kept away from those young players, because at the very least with his on-ice play, he's not doing a particularly good job at leading by example, because Bonino, in his main draw as a player, which has been his defensive game, he has just been awful at times this season. Interestingly enough, back at the start of the year when he was having all of those struggles offensively, reminder, he did not score a point until about a quarter of the way through the season. That was actually maybe his best stretch of hockey defensively, where he actually looked like a decent third line center, just wasn't really getting the points, wasn't just getting any really good bounces going his way. But now the bounces have started to go his way, but his defensive game has just completely slipped. It feels as though every single game his line is the worst one for the San Jose Sharks, and he is not doing anything to help in that particular role. And like I mentioned earlier, he is on a 2-year deal, so the Sharks are actually stuck with him not only for the remainder of this season, but for also next year on top of that, and he's just not been good. If his name wasn't Nick Bonino and his name was, I don't know, Jonathan Dahlen, he would have been benched ages ago, but he manages to keep his spot in the lineup just based off of, veteran presence or anything like that. Another player who also really struggled here tonight that I do want to talk about would actually be Marc-Edouard Vlasic. I mentioned last game against the Seattle Kraken that Vlasic actually looked okay, didn't necessarily have the toughest of competition, but played a decent amount of ice time and actually looked okay in that extended role. So here tonight, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to do poorly, but my God, was this a terrible performance from Marc-Edouard Vlasic tonight. It felt as though there were 2, maybe even 3 times where Vlasic was beat wide, and not necessarily because he was caught flat-footed or the other player had just more speed than him in that particular situation, but it felt as though he was almost having an effortless type of performance where he was just doing some really weak stick checks, or he wasn't laying the body on that particular player, and they were able to easily outmaneuver him time and time again. It was very difficult to watch Vlasic throughout the majority of this game. Now, I don't have a massive rant about it like I do about Bonino, because Bonino was, of course, a newcomer this past offseason where hopes were kind of high coming in. Meanwhile, for Vlasic, hopes were pretty low and have been pretty low for these past couple of seasons, but it's just that he reached kind of a new low here tonight. I don't expect that is going to end up being a consistent force or anything moving forward, but like I said by Bonino, if his name wasn't Marc-Edouard Vlasic and his name was, let's say, Ryan Merkley, he'd probably or almost certainly be benched for the upcoming game. However, the Sharks are quite short-handed defensively, and I highly doubt a player like Santeri Hitaka is going to be knocking on the door to get Vlasic out of the lineup, so we'll likely see him again. The only other player or players who I do want to talk about for tonight's game would actually be the Sharks' goaltenders, and the reason I say goaltenders is because Reimer actually left at the end of the first period, or going into the second period, and Zach Sawchenko had to fill in relief, which is actually quite interesting because Bob Booner was doing literally everything in his power to prevent Zach Sawchenko from actually seeing a lick of time here during this stretch of games, because he's been playing Reimer absolutely non-stop. Back-to-back games, you play Reimer. 3 games in 4 nights, you play Reimer each and every time. But there was no choice when Reimer went down with an injury, probably from a broken back from having to carry this team over this past 8 or 9 games. And so Zach Sawchenko stepped in the second period and had some pretty big skates to fill, I would say. Reimer was superb, and the absolutely only reason why the Sharks were only trailing by a single goal going into that second period And honestly, I thought Zach Sawchenko did a very, very good job in relief, which is definitely a good thing to see because of the fact that we do not exactly know the severity of James Rimer's injury. Is he out long term? Is it just a singular game type of thing? Is it, we don't exactly know, and we also do not exactly know how close Adin Hill is to return at this point. And so it's possible we may end up seeing Zach Sawchenko having to start games, or at least a game, over these next couple of days, which is, maybe a bit of a scary thing, but judging by his performance here tonight, maybe it's not actually as scary. The 2 goals that he did let in, both to Riley Smith, he had very little chance on. The first one was on a 2-on-1. The second was off of a very, very nice little tipping, passing type play between the Golden Knights players. William Karlsson with a very nice tip pass over to Riley Smith, who just had to put the puck in the net very, very easily. But otherwise, Sawchenko had some nice saves. It was a very, very solid and calming performance, which was absolutely nice to see, because if I actually look back at his relief performance, the major, thing that most people think about when they think of Zach Sawchenko, which was his relief performance back at least it's a couple months ago at this point against the Pittsburgh Penguins, when the Sharks were trailing, I believe it was 6-1 at the end of the first period. Sawchenko made some nice saves, but it also felt like at times he was kind of getting bailed out a bit, that Penguins players were either shooting it right into him or just barely missing the net. But here tonight, I felt as though a lot more credit had to go towards Sawchenko for how he looked here tonight. So definitely pretty solid performance, but we can still definitely hope that Reimer isn't out long term. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will indeed be back in action, and that will be all the way on Saturday, where they will take on the Nashville Predators, a team that they haven't played since the first few games of the season. That was actually, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, their first loss of the entire year after they came out the gate 4-0 to start. So we'll see if the Sharks can get some sort of revenge for that. Class dismissed.